So I start this project by cutting all my boards down to their rough length. I'm actually going to add 6 inches to each board so that when I glue up the top, I'll be able to take a straight edge, strike a line across each end of the top, and with a circular saw and a hand saw later, I can cut that nice and flush. I'm using my miter saw, but if you don't have a miter saw, you could use a circular saw or a hand saw or even a jigsaw. Pretty much anything to get the job done. Don't be afraid if you don't have these tools. What you will probably need is a decent table saw, something that you can rip stock that's up to 2 inches thick. I'm ripping these boards down to 4 inches wide for the top. Actually more like 4 1/8, because after I hand plane everything and flatten everything, I give myself about an eighth of an inch because I know I'll remove that. I'll be doing my glue up on a couple sawhorses that I made just for this project. I found the plans online. They're really easy to do. They took me about an hour, and I'll link those plans, if I can remember, down in the description. Okay, so I got all my boards cut and I'm ready to start gluing up the top. I wanted to show you something really important to do when using these sawhorses before you start gluing up. So let me show you what I did here. Essentially what I'm looking for is any kind of twist between these two sawhorses, and it's going to be hard for the autofocus, but what I'm doing is I'm sighting along this sawhorse close to me. I'm looking at the top of the other one. I'm trying to see if one edge of the top over there is higher than the other edge. They're both dead even now. There was a little bit of twist, but I fixed it with a couple of shims down here at the feet. I have a shim there and a shim there to correct the little bit of twist that was in this, because when you're gluing up all these pieces for the top, if there's a twist in it, that twist is going to translate to your glued up top, and you have a lot more difficulty getting the twist out with a hand plane or whatever. Another thing you can do is I took a level and ran the level across the two. They don't need to be level, but what I'm doing is I'm measuring how far that bubble is past the line, and it's a 1/16 of an inch right here. And if I take it over to the other side, it's the same 1/16 of an inch. So that's kind of another check. Now I know that when I put my boards on these sawhorses and glue them up, they're going to remain nice and flat and true, and there isn't going to be any twist in them. So before we do this glue up, I want to throw a couple tips at you. Anytime you're doing a large glue up like this, you really need to do a practice run. Make sure that you have everything in order, because you only have about a 10-minute open time on Titebond 3, and it's only 5 minutes on Titebond 1 and Titebond 2, which means you don't have a lot of time, and if you don't go through a dry run, kind of get everything in order, you could end up having a problem and needed to scramble around, and then you'll elapse that 10-minute open time, and then your glue is not going to bond nearly as good as it should. So what I do is I get my cauls around, I get my clamps around, and something that's really difficult with cauls is holding the top caul and the bottom caul together and trying to get clamps on them. A really awesome little tip is just take a couple rubber bands, and also I have just some sheathing tape, but you can use wax paper or whatever, so that the cauls don't end up getting glued to the tabletop or whatever you're laminating. So I basically just take my two cauls, spread them apart with the rubber bands, and now the rubber bands will hold them in place. Then you can quickly grab your clamps, clamp it in place, just kind of get it a little bit snug, then bring over your bigger clamp for the end, tighten it a little bit, then going back and forth and tighten these, tighten this some more, and that'll ensure that you have a really, really nice flat top across here. You don't get any boards that'll sneak on you. It'll save you a lot of work flattening once these tops are done. So there's your tip. So even with all the practice I did, I still came really close to elapsing my 10-minute open time because I tried gluing too many boards at once. So my recommendation to you is to do this glue up in 3 separate stages and then glue those 3 pieces together at the end. I used a paint roller that I got from Lowe's to try to quickly get enough glue down, but the paint roller also wasn't putting a lot of glue down as much as I would like. So they make, Lowe's doesn't make, but like Rockler and other different companies make these glue application bottles that kind of will spread out a bunch at once. Or there's kind of these spreaders that are like a trowel, so you can dump a bunch of glue on and kind of trowel it around, almost like a credit card with ridges in it. Find something, do some practice, make sure you're going to be able to get enough glue down quickly before you actually attempt it on the big tabletop. And you definitely want to have a lot of clamps. That's important too. Now there's a good chance that once you go to glue up your separate pieces into the big bench top, there's going to be a gap. So hopefully you have a well-sharpened hand plane and you tune both those pieces back and forth to test to make sure they fit nice and smooth, or if you have a belt sander or a power planer, just go nice and slow and test it quite often to make sure that they line up nice. Now once you're comfortable and the pieces line up nice and flat and straight, add glue to both those sides and clamp those pieces together. Again, using cawls to make sure both pieces are as flat as possible. That'll save you a lot of extra work at the end. Now you're going to see me cutting the 2 outside boards that I'll clamp to the bench top. Now, I wanted to make the rear of the twin screw vise, the rear chop, all one solid piece. So what I did was I ripped the board down the middle, stopped the saw, and then I'll cut out that 3-inch chunk the whole length, which essentially will be waste material, and then I'll glue those pieces on, and you'll kind of see here in a second. Now I'm not going to recommend you do that for the bench. And in the plans, I'm recommending that you actually just glue on those 2 pieces that will make up the rear chop. The glued on pieces will be just as strong, and it'll actually make laying out the vices and routing out the groove for the sliding dead man later a lot easier. So you're seeing me do this work right now, but essentially you won't do this part. You'll glue the entire bench top at once. You won't add these 2 pieces on later on. What you'll do is after you cut all the joinery for on the bottom of the bench top, then you'll glue on the 2 rear chops. So here you can kind of see what I'm talking about. You can see that the rear chops are integrated into that board rather than being added on via gluing later on. Like I said, I don't recommend doing it this way. It's way more work, and it's really not that much more effective, if at all more effective. Gluing those pieces on is going to be extremely strong. And because these pieces are wider than the rest of the bench top, it's actually a challenge to get a good glue up this way. So that's yet another reason not to do it this way. So once the glue is dry on the top, I'll begin flattening it. And you can see I just clamp to the sawhorses, and the sawhorses are heavy enough and the bench is heavy enough that it actually doesn't move hardly at all while you're planing, which is perfect. So I'll take a number 4 Stanley, which I converted here to a scrub plane. You can see there was a large camber on that blade, and I actually took a file and filed so that the mouth opening was larger so that larger shavings could escape. I'll also use a number 6, so I'll go over it first with the scrub plane and knocking off any high spots and doing kind of a rough flattening of it. And because I took such care with using the cawls, the bench top is actually really nice and flat already, so it doesn't take a whole lot of work. So I'll go diagonally or almost straight across perpendicular to the top, and go all the way down one side, turn around, come all the way down the other side. Now be careful when you're planing past the end of the board. You can see I put a chamfer on the bench so that it didn't actually blow out the other side. So just be careful when you're planing past, or you might end up blowing out some material on the other side. Then I'll flip the bench over and do the same thing on that side, but I'm not going to go as crazy trying to get as flat on the underside. It's really not as important. I just want to make sure the areas where the legs are going to be mortise and tenon into the bottom are nice and flat. So I'll go over this a few times, get it pretty close, but I'm not going to worry about getting it dead flat like I will the top later on. You could also use a router sled and flattening jig, you know, like you see a lot of people do for big slabs or something like that to flatten the top, but you'll still probably need a hand plane to really smooth everything out. Then I'm going to take a drywall square, strike a straight line across, measure 9 feet from that, and strike another line on the other side. Then I'll take a circular saw and cut those ends off. Now the circular saw can't reach all the way through, obviously. I used a straight line guide that I made for the circular saw on one side, but that is about 3/4 inches tall, so that was that much material I couldn't get down with my circular saw blade. So on the other side, I actually use a straight edge guide that I just clamp to the bench top. That way I can get a little bit deeper with the circular saw, and that's that much less material that I don't have to saw through with the handsaw. Another thing that I would warn you about is don't try to cut through that entire top in one pass. You need to like go down in sections. So maybe do one inch at a time. It's asking a lot for a circular saw to try to cut its maximum depth through hard maple or oak or even southern yellow pine. I would probably do it in a couple passes. If you have a track saw or something like that, this would be the perfect thing to use it on, but I don't have one, so I'd made this jig years ago for different reasons and use it a lot when I need to get a nice straight cut. But like I said, it makes me proud about another 3/4 of an inch. So that was a lot of extra sawing and a lot of material to handsaw. So on the other side, I just clamped the straight edge straight to the bench. When using just a straight edge guide, all you need to do is measure the distance from the side of your circular saw base to the blade and then clamp to that distance, and it'll pretty much get you spot on. Like I said before, do this in a couple passes, maybe 1 inch at a time until you're all the way down to max depth. Don't try to do this in just one pass. You might run into some trouble. So because my circular saw doesn't make it all the way through, I have to take a hand saw and finish cutting both ends off. Now if you have a larger diameter circular saw or any other kind of means of cutting these ends off, that would be ideal, because then you don't have to hand saw those ends off, and then you don't have to do as much work smoothing all those saw marks with a hand plane or a sander.